As a presidential candidate earlier this year, Joe Biden made it clear that he's committed to reviving the Iran nuclear deal. In an op-ed for CNN in September, Biden wrote, if Iran returns to strict compliance, the U.S. would rejoin the agreement as a starting point for follow-on negotiations. Jake Sullivan, Biden's choice for National Security Advisor, said last week that the new administration will first attempt to put Iran back into the box of the nuclear deal, and only then move forward to a follow-on negotiation to include Iran's missile program and its regional behavior. There are many problems with this formulation, and I'd like to briefly sketch out some of the potential pitfalls and minefields that are inherent in this approach. First, the nuclear deal did not put Iran into a very strong box. It put Iran in a situation in which key non-proliferation restrictions gradually sunset, as Luke mentioned, and that would allow Tehran to expand its uranium enrichment activities to an industrial scale and set the stage for a possible sprint to a nuclear breakout if Iran shrugs off its non-proliferation commitments, as it has done so many times before. That is to say that the walls of the box that Iran had been placed in gradually would dissolve and become paper thin. The Biden administration needs to think outside this box. The Obama JCPOA box was poorly designed from the beginning, and the US cannot afford to return to the old deal because that deal did too little for too short a time to effectively restrict Iran's nuclear ambitions. The UN arms embargo already has lapsed as scheduled under the deal after only 5 years. Ridiculously short sunset clauses remove key non-proliferation restrictions on uranium enrichment after 10 to 15 years. Secondly, if Washington lifts its nuclear sanctions and returns to the old deal, then it will squander its main source of leverage and forfeit any chance of reaching an acceptable outcome in follow-on negotiations on other issues. Instead, Washington should seek a new agreement that rectifies the major flaws of the old deal, including by extending the time frame of the nuclear restrictions, adding restrictions on ballistic missile development, and requiring Tehran to come clean about its past nuclear weapons efforts. Third, the world has changed significantly since the JCPOA was negotiated 5 years ago. In 2018, Iran's nuclear archive was stolen and revealed by Israel's Mossad intelligence agency, exposing Iran's detailed plans for building and testing 5 nuclear devices, among other things. These plans reportedly were shelved by 2003 when Iran's nuclear weapons program was downsized and reorganized, probably out of fear of a US military response, as in neighboring Iraq. But the fact that Tehran retained the nuclear archive shows that it wanted to preserve its nuclear plans and maintain the option of taking them off the shelf again at some point. Therefore, the JCPOA was built on a foundation of Iranian deception from the very start. The nuclear archive was not known by the Obama administration before the JCPOA, and that proved that Iran did not come clean on its nuclear weapons program. To clear the way for the 2015 deal, the International Atomic Energy Agency was pressured to close the books on Iran's past activities and downplay issues related to Iran's undeclared nuclear work. Outstanding questions were left unresolved. Iran was required to respond to the questions posed by the IAEA, but under the terms of the nuclear deal, those responses could remain incomplete, untruthful, and unverifiable, and yet sanctions relief followed. Washington should demand that Tehran must come clean on its past nuclear weapons efforts, or negotiations are off. Any new negotiations must reflect the new facts contained in the nuclear archive. The US cannot trust Iran to fulfill its non-proliferation promises in the future unless Iran owns up to its nuclear activities in the past. My fourth point is that in addition to its premature sunset conditions, the nuclear deal was criticized because it neglected Iran's ballistic missile program, and that's an inherently important part of any nuclear weapons program. Even Germany, which historically has given Iran the benefit of the doubt on many issues, even Germany has called for the inclusion of ballistic missiles in any future agreement. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas asserted earlier this month that a return to the previous deal, let's see, I better get this right. He said a return to the previous deal will not suffice. There will have to be a kind of nuclear agreement plus, which is also in our interest. We have clear expectations of Iran, no nuclear weapons and no ballistic missile program that threatens the entire region. Fifth, in addition to the substance of negotiations, the administration also must be mindful of the process through which it legitimizes any deal. It must not repeat what I call the Obama administration's original sin, that is, trying to bypass Congress on the issue by instead going to the UN for validation. A sustainable agreement requires bipartisan buy-in from Congress. And the first thing Congress should do in the new year is demand that the administration structure any future nuclear deal as a treaty to be approved by the Senate. Trying to do an end run around Congress will only boost the odds that the agreement will eventually collapse, as the last one did when rejected by a new administration. Sixth, I think the negotiations are likely to be much more difficult than many expect, because Iran seeks to re-enter the old deal with absolutely no modifications. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif has ruled out negotiating any changes in the JCPOA. He told a conference in Italy earlier this month that it will never be renegotiated, period. President Rouhani has chimed in on December 9th, saying that the nuclear deal could be restored without negotiations. It's impossible to imagine that happening, but those statements reflect the urgency for the regime to lift sanctions and also reflect Rouhani's desire to safeguard his legacy, which in large part boils down to preserving the JCPOA. Iran's ultra-hardliners who have attacked Rouhani for the JCPOA also have weighed in by passing a law on December 1st that set a 60-day deadline for the US to lift sanctions. If the US doesn't do so, by the law, Iran is required to raise uranium enrichment levels to 20% from its current level of 3 to 5%, and that's a huge raise, install more advanced centrifuges, and kick out international inspectors. These threats, made to put pressure on the US, will also put pressure on the Europeans who still cling to the JCPOA, and it will put pressure on them to finally admit that the deal is dead. If Tehran follows through on these threats, it could lead the EU3, UK, France, and Germany, who have been in part of these negotiations from the beginning, to finally take action by declaring Iran to be in the breach of the JCPOA and the triggering snapback UN sanctions. That would be a good thing, not only because it would escalate pressure on Iran, but also because it would finally drive a stake through the heart of the zombie 2015 nuclear deal, which remains dead but not buried. And to reach a new deal, the old deal must be cleared away. Iran essentially is saying that it's the old deal or no deal at all, despite the fact that it's desperate to lift sanctions. If Washington fails to call this bluff and unwisely returns to the original deal, then it will continue to face the same problems that arose under the old deal, only the sunset provisions will come 5 years sooner, which would be crazy. Iran once again will pocket billions of dollars in sanctions relief that it will plow into its aggressive military interventions in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, in escalating its military buildup. Now unencumbered by the UN arms embargo, it will invest it in its network of proxy forces or even in its nuclear program. Immediately re-entering the JCPOA would let Iran off the hook and squander the powerful diplomatic leverage linked to the sanctions ramped up by the Trump administration. This would also reduce the chances of a follow-on agreement that the new administration says it wants. Although Washington should leave the door open for diplomacy, there should be no return to the old deal. A much more restrictive agreement is required to permanently and indisputably end Iran's nuclear weapons ambition. So for me, the bottom line is the US position should be a new deal or there is no deal.